letting us know on Zoom. Um, okay, so there were these multiracial coalitions for reproductive freedom in the 70s and 80s, which really kind of clues us into the fact that there were lots of folks who in various ways were kind of contributing to the development of this. Recent scholarship also demonstrates really the impossibility of seeing the emergence of a reproductive justice framework and movement as a strictly domestic story. And of course, Sister Song's emphasis on human rights should kind of be an important cue here. In an essay entitled it's entitled Reproductive Justice, Born Transnational. Laura Briggs situates the emergence of reproductive justice in, quote, a rich and extensive engagement with the transnational activism of the global women's movement. Briggs draws her analysis in part on, she kind of draws from, in part, the recollections of an activist named Loretta Ross, who's really important to this story. Loretta Ross was among the Black feminists who coined the term reproductive justice there in Chicago. She is appropriately credited with being among the framework's most influential theorists. In conversations with scholars over the last few years, Ross has situated these personal developments in the context of her own and other American women of color's participation in more than a decade of global feminist solidarity work, leading up to that 1994, or I should say prior to that 1994 Chicago meeting. Ross, for example, attended UN conferences for women in Copenhagen, Nairobi, and Beijing in the 80s and 90s. And then in addition to that, through entities like the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, she traveled throughout much of Latin America in this same period, meeting with indigenous women's groups. Through her travels, Ross learned a good deal, as she is quick to point out, about the feminist work of women throughout the global South. So my point here is to say that the genealogies of reproductive justice are rich and expansive, simultaneously specific and contingent, and more kind of amorphous and transnational. And so today, oh, did I do that wrong too?
No, I did it wrong. I just wanted to be able to share it with the Zoom folks.
Yes. Okay.
This is basically mine.
No, you're fine.
This is why it's bad when the tech people don't come.
Okay. Thank you for your patience.
Yes, I think that's not working.
Okay. Okay. So, so today I'd like to explore at least a few of these, what we might say, these genealogical strands, by taking us back to the 1970s and 80s, critical years in which Native American women articulated an early vision of Native reproductive justice, born out of the anti-colonial struggles of the Red Power era. So I open reproduction on the reservation by introducing an intertribal organization, an intertribal group called the Women of All Red Nations, or WARN. In September 1978, women from more than 30 Native nations gathered in Rapid City, South Dakota for the first meeting of this new organization. The image that I have on the slide here is from the cover of WARN's second annual report. And this particular report, the second report, centers on a second meeting, a second major meeting gathering in Seattle the following year. So this image kind of at the center, which circulated widely in WARN and Red Power circles, hints at WARN's priorities and gives us a sense of its conception of itself as an organization. So we see an Indigenous woman holding the world in her hands and an infant in a cradle board. WARN's first leaders organized the gathering because they had determined that a new women-led Indigenous organization was necessary to tackle issues of particular importance to women, children, and families. And we'll get a better sense of why they determined that shortly. So to give you a sense just of kind of what's coming here, in the latter half of my talk, so down here, I'll dig into Warren's wide-ranging reproductive agenda and emphasize these women's theoretical and practical contributions to 21st century conceptions of Native reproductive justice. But before we get there, we need to understand how these women, or I would suggest that we need to understand how these women, numbering more than 1,000, wound up in Rapid City that September. And as it happens that the road that they took there, the path that they took there was largely a transnational one. So the women who gathered in South Dakota were no novices, or at least most of them were no novices to political activism. Many had been active in Red Power politics for at least a decade, and in some cases longer. And if you're not familiar with Red Power, as many folks aren't, what we might call the Red Power era, sometimes folks are a bit more familiar with Black Power, right? But what we might call the Red Power era emerged in the 1960s when growing numbers of Native individuals, especially youth, began forming new organizations and employing new tactics to advance Native causes. This wave of activists really rejected the assimilationist pressures of previous decades. So they defiantly resisted generations of efforts to get them to kind of integrate into American society and discard their tribal identity and their indigenous cultures. And this had been really the thrust of federal Indian policy assimilation had since at least the late 19th century. Now, in advocating for Native sovereignty and Native self-determination, Red Power proponents envisioned a movement capable of uniting political struggle with cultural resurgence and spiritual rebirth. The Red Power era is characterized by the emergence of new organizations, but perhaps most iconically, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which was founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 1968. So many of Warren's founders and early leaders were closely associated with AIM. They taught, for example, at these so-called survival schools that AIM members founded. So they started their own independent schools in the early 1970s in cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, and on reservations like Pine Ridge. So Warren women were very involved in these efforts. Warren women also, or the women who would later become Warren women, played pivotal roles in these kind of high profile, highly publicized protests and occupations in the late 60s and 70s, including a 71-day occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1973. This era also saw the emergence of new information and communication networks. So in the same year that AIM was founded in the Twin Cities, activists in the Mohawk Nation in New York started Akwesasne Notes, which quickly became what one historian refers to as a communications center for Indians in North America. The publication billed itself as the voice of Indigenous peoples. So this issue I have that's on the top here from early 1974, there the circulation was 65,000. It would grow to about 83,000 within just a couple years. So this is like a real key moment for Akwesasne Notes and the role that it played in connecting folks throughout Indian country. And it did so in part right through this subscription model, but also because of ties between the folks at Akwesasne Notes and a group called, for example, the White Roots of Peace, which was an intertribal traveling group. By intertribal, I mean there were folks from different Native nations that came together and called themselves kind of like an educational troupe, right? A traveling group that visited Indigenous communities really throughout the continent and advocated for the revival of Indigenous traditions, and they promoted Native sovereignty. So women who attended Warren's first meeting in 1978 had been involved in all of these efforts, right? So survival schools, occupations, publications like Notes, White Roots of Peace. Now, this isn't to say that all of them had been involved in all of it, right? But everyone there had pretty much had some sort of affiliation with at least this type of activity. Now, that said, to truly understand Warren, I think we especially need to rewind to the spring of 1974. By that point, AIM, remember, had been around for just over 5 years, and AIM had become really frustrated with the prospects for political advancement in the United States and began to look outward. So AIM leaders called for an intertribal meeting. You'll note I keep using intertribal, right? Like that's a really important facet of this Red Power era. So they called for this intertribal meeting at Standing Rock on the Standing Rock Reservation that summer. This week-long meeting was really a phenomenal achievement. More than 5,000 representatives from nearly 100 indigenous communities in North America and Latin America attended, as did representatives from African liberation and Puerto Rican independence movements. The most notable outcome of the gathering was the establishment of the International Indian Treaty Council, or IITC. And don't worry too much about that name or that acronym, but we'll talk about kind of what they did and why that was important. But at any rate, the historian Nick Estes characterizes the IITC as the international arm of the American Indian movement. So a man named Jimmy Durham was present at the IITC's founding and for a time served as the new organization's president. And Durham later emphasized that, he later emphasized, I should say, the important role, and that was his language, that women played at Standing Rock and on the Treaty Council. He also acknowledged that they sometimes had to argue with men for authority. Now, historians and other scholars have sometimes cited 1974 as Warren's founding, which, and remember I said 1978. So for the record, that's incorrect, that's wrong. But the confusion likely stems from the prominence of some of these very same women who would later found an AIM in the early IITCs, or in the IITC's kind of founding and early history. And so in some ways, we can see this organization as something of a precursor. Okay, so I said what would be important is what the IITC did. And its purpose was to achieve recognition. Its kind of sole or primary purpose was to achieve recognition at the United Nations for Indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Again, they were frustrated with the US kind of geopolitical situation and were looking outward. So at Standing Rock, during that week-long meeting, attendees adopted a Declaration of Continuing Independence. And this document accused the United States of quote, denying all Native people their international treaty rights, treaty lands, and basic human rights of freedom and sovereignty. I want to just add, I've used sovereignty several times, and we can, what it means is actually somewhat kind of complicated and multifaceted, but think largely for the purposes of right now in terms of like the ability to kind of govern oneself, right? And kind of to control one's future, right? And largely in a political sense here in this context. This document also pledged their solidarity with Indigenous peoples throughout the globe, working toward comparable projects of sovereignty and human rights. Now, women, some of these IITC women forged some of these important kind of early contacts with other folks throughout the hemisphere, especially the following year when they attended the International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City, and they did so as delegates of AIM and the IITC. Red Power activists' embrace of human rights language really kind of accelerated at this point in the mid 1970s. The year after Standing Rock, the same year as that International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City, Akwesasne Notes published an entire special issue on, quote, the conspiracy to repress human rights in North America, in which authors recounted an indigenous struggle for human rights that dated to the arrival of Columbus, and that's their language. But, and this is, I think, like a really crucial point, the human rights discourse and framework that indigenous activists in the United States, and actually more broadly, employed differed, and as political scientists have noted, from conceptions of human rights advanced by international institutions in these years. So on international stages like the 1977 United Nations Convention in Geneva, Switzerland on discrimination against Indigenous peoples, I will be returning to that convention soon. It's a kind of a convention that the IATC was very instrumental in bringing about. But on stages like that, in platforms like that, Indigenous delegates from throughout the Western Hemisphere started to really evoke human rights alongside treaty rights in the context of the United States and Canada, where that's relevant, and what they referred to as Indian rights and Indigenous rights. So they saw themselves as educating and really kind of advocating international audiences about, quote, human rights from a Native perspective, right? So that's how they were framing this. This is how we are thinking about human rights. This is what human rights means to us. And human rights from a Native perspective required a framework capacious enough to encompass group rights as well as individual rights, and a framework in which the themes of sovereignty, identity, culture, and survival were really foremost, right? So they argued, and here I'll quote Professor Miranda Johnson, that, quote, the stakes of survival involved, that is, the right to exist as a people, lay at the heart of what it meant to be human. The recognition of their peoplehood was a human right. And so when we're talking about the stakes of survival involved, right, the right to exist as a people, Indigenous delegates making this argument in the 1970s, put that in the context, right, of what I said about generations of assimilationist policies, right, that had tried to kind of individualize and detribalize them. So I've previously argued in Reproduction on the Reservation and elsewhere that the late 1970s and early 80s, this period that I'm talking about, was a critical moment in the emergence of an early vision, articulation, and kind of formation of Native reproductive justice. But what I haven't previously done justice to is the extent to which this occurred against the backdrop of and in conversation with unprecedented Indigenous organizing throughout the hemisphere. So discourses regarding sovereignty, group rights, a right to peoplehood, a right to distinctiveness, a right to survival in its many forms, all informed the ways that Indigenous women in the United States would come to understand the reproductive agendas that demanded their attention in the coming years, would shape kind of how they conceptualize them. And it's equally critical to know that they were very much part of these participants in the articulation and formation of these discourses in the first place. So we can see this in many locations, in many locations and settings and contexts in, say, 1977, 1978. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on that UN convention in Geneva that I mentioned. This is a convention attended by representatives from more than 100 Indigenous communities throughout the hemisphere. Madonna Thunderhawk, Pat Bellinger, Winona LaDuke, and Marie Sanchez were among the Geneva attendees who would later gather in Rapid City. Once again, Jimmy Durham acknowledged these women's work as crucial. Quote, Indian women did most of the solid work at our conference in the United Nations, he reported shortly after the return. In particular, the Northern Cheyenne activist and tribal judge Marie Sanchez delivered an address on behalf of the women of the Western Hemisphere. That's how she framed it, that offered a gendered analysis of genocide. Sanchez argued that in targeting women's bodies and procreative capacity in ways that I'll discuss at greater length shortly, colonial powers threatened Native peoples' very survival, an urgent situation that, in her view, could really only be remedied by international recognition of their rights as sovereign peoples. Indigenous delegates to the 1977 UN Convention didn't actually achieve the type of formal recognition that they desired. For whatever it's worth, previous generations of American Indians had been similarly rebuffed. But the conference galvanized Indigenous organizing at pretty much all levels. And in fact, some accounts directly link that convention with Warren's founding soon after, because delegates from the United States during their time in Geneva couldn't help but notice that most of the other Indigenous groups gathered there had women's societies, as had been common in many Native American societies prior to colonization. So one participant observed that, quote, all of the other liberation organizations, they have organizations of women, and they are winning their fight for freedom. So when these hundreds of women and actually several men gathered in Rapid City in 1978, they continued the discussion that female delegates had advanced in Geneva. Sterilization abuse, which Marie Sanchez, again here, powerfully labeled the modern form of genocide, was at the top of their agenda. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with this painful history, scholars estimate that physicians sterilized more than 1/4 of Native women of childbearing age in the 6 years following the passage of this piece of legislation in 1970, the Family Planning and Population Research Act. And that act did a lot of things, but one of the things that it did was it subsidized these procedures. And when we're talking about permanent sterilization, what I'm referring to are surgical procedures to eliminate one's procreative capacity. For women, typically that is through tubal ligation or hysterectomy. Now, I want to be really clear that when I'm talking about like dramatic increases in sterilization rates, right, in and near Native communities, I'm actually not suggesting, right, that all of these procedures were performed coercively, right? I do think there's it's worth thinking about as activists debated a lot at the time. Activists and actually just many other folks later debated a lot about that at the time, about kind of what the meaning and weight of concepts like consent and choice, like what weight that holds in a context of colonialism. But I'm going to kind of set that conversation aside. And for our purposes, I just want to note what's important is that earlier in the decade, earlier in the 1970s, female Indigenous health workers had begun to raise concerns about sterilization practices that they viewed as unethical and even coercive. These practices that they said were occurring primarily, but not exclusively, in government hospitals. These are concerns, by the way, that had been covered in Akwesasne notes since at least 1973. So within a few years of these kind of the earliest alarm bells by being sounded by health professionals, activists had galvanized around the issue to an extent that finally kind of demanded attention by at least some federal policymakers. In 1976, the Government Accountability Office released the results of a somewhat kind of limited or narrow investigation into the issue. And this investigation did find evidence of several violations of protocol So including violations of a moratorium on procedures performed on women under 21 years of age, violations also of a mandated waiting period that was in place at the time of 72 hours between consent, the kind of giving of consent and the operation. And that was to ensure that there was enough time. Well, first of all, it was to ensure that nothing was signed under duress, right? And that someone had enough, the individual had enough time to make sure that they understood what they were doing. Government investigators also found that many hospitals used inadequate consent forms that didn't explain alternative options, like alternative birth control options, as they were supposed to do, or make clear that a woman's birth control decisions had no bearing on her eligibility for government programs. So by the time that WARN Women gathered for this first meeting, which was maybe about a year and a half or so after this study was released, activists had started to investigate the issue in their own communities, which led some to fear that the government report significantly underestimated the volume of such procedures and misrepresented the circumstances in which some of them occurred, which is to say coercively, under pressure or duress, and or on the basis of deception and misinformation. Black and Latina women were also sterilized at disproportionate rates in these years, and raised somewhat comparable concerns, right, about the kind of circumstances, or I should say about kind of coercive circumstances. And it's really this history, or I should say, it's in large part this history that led to that second reproductive justice plank that I mentioned, right? The right to have children. So through coalitions with women of color and socialist feminists, white socialist feminists largely, activists ultimately succeeded in securing some protections against coercive sterilization. But despite all of their coalitional work, WARN's specific analysis really, I think, does merit attention, because WARN offered this kind of multi-layered analysis of these sorts of abuses, as I should say, did other Native women in these years. So they spoke about trauma for the individual woman, kind of an individual rights framework, right? Violation of one's individual rights. They also viewed coercive sterilization as an assault on Native families, an assault that had been ongoing in various forms since at least the late 19th century, right, when the federal government embraced its assimilationist agenda in earnest. But WARN members also, and perhaps especially, understood coercive sterilization as an assault on Native sovereignty. 1 year earlier, the IITC, which again we can see as something of a precursor, had denounced sterilization as a direct attack on nationhood. The council insisted that Native women must have the right to choose sterilization as a birth control method, an important point, but that, quote, for Native people, it should be seen in the context of national identity. If an Indian woman is a member of a 3,000 member nation, sterilization has serious consequences for the survival of the people as a whole. So there's that survival kind of theme and frame again, end quote. They also, WARN Women, also maintained their hemispheric anti-colonial perspective, as Geneva had made painfully clear to them that forcible sterilization, coercive sterilization was a shared struggle for many Indigenous women across the continent. I don't know how well you can actually read that, but so WARN leaders regularly cited the United Nations definition of genocide, adopted as part of the General Assembly's first Human Rights Treaty in 1948, in their critiques of US action or inaction when it came to Indigenous women's reproductive autonomy. So the UN definition, for those unfamiliar, it got a little sneak peek there. It delineates 5 specific acts that, when committed with, here's the language at the top, committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, constitute genocide, okay? And activists like Pat Bellinger, she pointed to especially the fourth enumerated act here, right? The imposition of measures intended to prevent births within the group, as evidence of coercive sterilizations, genocidal implications. But this fifth act here under E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, proved equally salient in this period as Native women struggled not only for the right to bear children, but to raise them. 1 year earlier, a nonprofit Native rights organization had released a really devastating report, claiming that in some states, and particularly states with large Indigenous populations, authorities had removed 25 to 35% of Native children from their homes and placed them in foster or adoptive homes, generally with white families. So Warren, like other Native activists and families, contended that what they saw is just this child welfare crisis, right? Like we're losing our children. Delegates to the United Nations referred to this as child stealing, capital C, capital S. But they argued that this is a product of colonialism and racism. And they placed these post-World War II removals of children within the context of nearly a century, more in some locations, of the removal of children, Native children, to federal or religious boarding schools for the purpose of assimilation. So that had been a kind of centerpiece of earlier federal Indian kind of political objectives, right? And in both cases, Warren and many contemporaries understood these separations as attempts to eradicate Native cultures. So kind of an attempt of a cultural genocide, right? And to undermine tribal sovereignty, right? They also insisted that these two injustices, so coercive sterilization and the removal of children, were insidiously linked. In describing the pressures Native women faced to acquiesce to a sterilization procedure, the AIM activist Mary Braveford later alleged that physicians and social workers repeatedly asked women pointed questions like, quote, "Wouldn't it be better for you not to have more children rather than have them wind up in a faraway foster home?" And what I think lots of other testimonies from this period make clear is that, like, even if that threat was not explicit, the removal rates that I mentioned, so that the kind of context, would certainly have made this outcome a reasonable fear for many. The passage of the Indian Child Welfare Act in 1978, and I don't know if folks have heard of ICWA, but it actually has been in the news some in recent years. I really, really, really recommend a podcast by a Cherokee journalist named Rebecca Nagel called This Land. Season 2 of This Land focuses on the history surrounding ICWA, really up to the present. But at any rate, so this is a law passed in 1978, legislation that arose from Native activism, that was championed by Indigenous delegates in Geneva and by Warren's early leaders, offers some protections from child welfare practices that separated Native children from their communities and cultures. It does so largely through recognition recognition of tribal jurisdiction over child welfare cases. So it relates in that way then to Indigenous sovereignty. And this key sovereignty component is arguably the central reason that ICWA has been the target of a series of well-funded legal challenges, most recently in a case that made it all the way up to the Supreme Court, Brackeen v. Holland. And I should add that the Supreme Court, its ruling came out just last year in 2023. Surprising many, it ruled in favor of the government, so in favor of this legislation, ICWA, it upheld ICWA. And that was a really hard-fought victory for Native reproductive justice. But There were additional obstacles hindering Native women's ability to raise children and families in safe and healthy environments, both in the 1970s and thereafter. Warren women spoke out, for example, about the continued racial disparities in Native infant mortality rates. This is something that many Black feminists were talking about in the same period, a symptom of inadequate and often racist healthcare, as well as of the material conditions of their daily lives. More recently, Native reproductive justice proponents, I should say, have dedicated a good deal of attention to disparities in maternal mortality and morbidity rates as well. Foreshadowing current RJ frameworks that, like today, view policing and mass incarceration as reproductive justice issues, Warren women spoke out about the incarceration of Red Power leaders, that, saying that this separation, right, separated women from their partners, right, their brothers, children from their families, their uncles, and so forth. So that broke up families, in other words. And I could certainly go on here about their agenda. We can perhaps talk more about it in a Q&A or after. But in the interest of time, I'll offer just one final example here, which is that Warren protested the destruction and erosion of tribal land bases. And in doing so, they drew explicit connections between environmental degradation on the one hand, and negative maternal and infant health outcomes on the other. So in terms of environmental degradation, I'm talking often about mining, so uranium and other forms of mining, but also about industrial pollution. So industrial pollution was a big deal in the Six Nations in New York, for example. In the months following the Seattle meeting that I mentioned, Warren members in South Dakota released a study that suggested that uranium mining on the Pine Ridge Reservation had serious consequences for community health, and they focused specifically on disproportionate rates of miscarriage and birth defects. And unfortunately, activists found similar outcomes in some other communities as well. So when Warren leaders collaborated with non-Native activists through organizations like the Reproductive Rights National Network into the 1980s, they pushed coalition members, so non-Native coalition members, on some of these issues, right? So they insisted that reproductive freedom, the language that they used at the time, required attention to concerns like toxic chemical poisons and the attempted takeover of Native lands and resources. Along these lines, arguably the most significant, I would say, theoretical contribution to emerge from Warren's first meeting and early years was the insistence that the wide-ranging issues that these women discussed were fundamentally intertwined. An analysis that emerged from cultural teachings, as well as from Native communities' intergenerational experiences as targets of US colonialism. So as Gaji Cook, a really kind of a prominent and important reproductive activist and environmental justice activist, explained, she said, as women of all red nations, we are concerned with issues that for Indian peoples are issues that mean our very survival. There's that theme again. We can't separate these issues into individual battles, although the battle is on all these fronts. We can't fragment the issues as the white man would have us do. We can't separate the birth of our children, the care and feeding of our children from the health and education of our children. And I think if you think back to those kind of three principles of reproductive justice, I think it's notable kind of what she's capturing of that here. And she would also, at least on many occasions, she and others would also go on to talk about how all of this could not be separated from the issue of sovereignty. So as was the case for the Black feminists who gathered in Chicago more than a decade later, Warren women did not entirely disregard the importance of a legal right to abortion, but they did challenge its primacy in many contemporary feminist agendas. And they challenged the idea that it could be viewed in isolation from these other issues. Again, very much in keeping, right, with a reproductive justice framework. Now, with the full implementation of the Hyde Amendment, and the Hyde Amendment prohibits public funding for abortion services. It's been in effect since the late 1970s. And since its kind of full implementation, abortion politics have gained prominence in Indian country. The legislation hinders the ability of all low-income women to terminate a pregnancy. It disproportionately, we know, affects women of color, people of color, but Native activists have long charged that the act really discriminates against them specifically because, at least in many cases, for those in federally recognized tribes, they're eligible to receive their health care from a federal agency, so hence public funds, right? So when Congresswoman Deb Haaland, who, for those of you who don't know, was one of the first 2 Native American women to be elected to the US Congress, when she co-organized a congressional briefing session on Native maternal and reproductive health in early 2019, so we've fast forwarded a bit, the repeal of the Hyde Amendment was among the Native experts' foremost recommendations. Now, as I suspect many folks in this room know, we've sort of moved in the opposite direction. And I think it's worth a brief digression from this 1970s, 80s moment on which we've been focused, because in the context of a discussion of Native reproductive justice, it's worth addressing the implications of another Supreme Court decision. So I just mentioned Brackeen, right? But the Supreme Court's 2022 decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. So that is the ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade. As Ray Lorenzo, founder of the nonprofit organization Indigenous Women Rising, a very important Native reproductive justice organization, noted soon after the Dobbs decision, she said, quote, Roe v. Wade, Supreme Court's 1973 decision, on abortion rights, has never been a reality for Native people. And so that's in part because of the Hyde Amendment, right? It's in part because of state restrictions. It's in part because of economic factors and access and geography. One could also add, I certainly would, and other scholars have, that Roe also has never been enough to meet Native people's needs, given the countless other obstacles that they've faced in pursuit of abortion access, but also reproductive health and bodily autonomy. And yet, okay, as Native attorneys and reproductive activists powerfully argued in an amicus brief submitted for the defendants in Dobbs, the overturning of Roe portends particularly harmful consequences for Native people. So this is an interesting kind of this dual reality, but somewhat paradoxical reality, right? That on the one hand, Roe was illusory, like it was kind of not tangible, not fully experienced by many Native people. That's true. And it's also true that its repeal carries particular dangers and burdens for them. And this kind of paradoxical dual reality, I think, really speaks to the need for robust reproductive justice agendas that attend to settler colonialism in the past and present. Okay, so back to this crucial moment of Warren's founding and early organizing. And I'm wrapping up here. In the feedback loop that emerged between theory and praxis and back again, Warren leaders did, to some degree, and many of them maintained their international focus, returning to the United Nations throughout the coming decade, and in some cases beyond. Then in 1985, some Warren women formally united with Indigenous women throughout the hemisphere by forming, when they established a new organization, the Indigenous Women's Network. Despite this, I think it's fair to say that well into the 21st century, international human rights law has struggled to meaningfully incorporate the expansive conception of, say, group rights, cultural rights that Native activists have long deemed as vital. And accountability in particular has remained a challenge, right, in kind of enforcing these international standards, human rights standards, particularly given the United States' failure to ratify key international treaties and agreements. So just as Ames' frustration with the prospects for political advancement within the United States had led it to look outward in the early 1970s, that conservatism and retrenchment of the Reagan years in terms of kind of the domestic scene, coupled with the slow pace of progress toward international recognition, really lent greater urgency and significance to Warren's grassroots initiatives to enact sovereignty in their daily lives. So before I mentioned kind of political sovereignty, well, they're using concepts like lived sovereignty, personal sovereignty, reproductive sovereignty. These are just some of the concepts that they employed. And it was at this local level that Native activists' kind of expansive visions of reproductive freedom, what would later be called reproductive justice, could seemingly best take form. I'll give just one example of many. The Women's Dance Health Project, another intertribal women's health collective in Minnesota's Twin Cities, which emerged directly from Warren's founding. So Gudgy Cook, right, had spoke in Rapid City, and she spoke out about the need for Native women to reclaim control over reproduction. She spoke about that in Rapid City, and afterwards, some women from Minnesota came up to her and said, "We really need you to put these ideas into practice." So in late 1978, Cook launched the project, which she hoped would serve as a guide, which she hoped would serve, quote, as a guide out of Native people's colonialized state. In the spirit of the philosophy that she articulated here, Cook's group laid midwifery, they attended home births, they supported women in hospital births, they acted as patient advocates, health advocates, they operated a women's health clinic, they maintained an active presence in Ames survival schools, they counseled women regarding birth control options and sterilization, and on and on and on. While the Women's Dance Health Project in the Twin Cities didn't survive the decade, it proved influential in spurring the creation of comparable projects in other cities on the reservations, some of which would join Sister Song as member organizations the following decade. I will say that grassroots kind of Native reproductive justice efforts like this often struggle to maintain funding because of funding organizations' kind of preference for a kind of more single issue focus. I see that again and again and again. At any rate, today, Native reproductive justice organizations and analyses challenge us to center colonialism and to theorize broadly about survival. So physical, political, cultural. In the past few years, prominent Indigenous feminists like the legal scholar Lauren Van Schilfgaard have reinvigorated demands for what we might call human rights from a Native feminist perspective. In doing so, they draw on a rich history and they join a decades-long struggle. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we definitely have some time for questions. We also have a little reception out in the cafe. I never like to be the one between people and their food, but I do think that we should take some time to ask some questions. So if students want to start, I have a question too, if that will generate. Yes, please.
Is this gonna be like, this report is like, we can rewatch it later?
Yes.
I showed up late and I'm still signing for it.
Then talk to me.
Also a good question. Yeah.
Yes. I will let all the professors in the history department know. It's actually going to be on the CLA YouTube channel. I'm not sure when it's going to be ready, but it'll be on the CLA YouTube channel. But I'll let all the history professors know and we'll get the word out. So you can definitely watch it again.
I'm sorry if you already mentioned this, but like, what made you interested in this work?
I mentioned a lot, so don't worry about any repeat questions. But no, I did not mention that. That's a great question. So what made me interested in this work? So I think that I have just had a long-standing interest in, and long-standing, I mean like since I was like 12, interest in reproductive politics, just kind of like broadly defined. And I don't especially know how that came about. So I don't know where, I can't go that far back, but then I had the privilege of working in a little bit in undergrad, but especially when I decided to do a master's program in history, and frankly, not because I knew, oh, I want to be a professor, but because I was like, I like history and I don't really know what to do. And so I did that. It was wonderful. And so I worked with an amazing professor there, a woman by the name of Margaret Jacobs, who, by the way, has written a really, really important book on Indigenous child removal. Actually, two really important books on Indigenous child removal in the United States and Australia. And so it was kind of while working with her in part that I was like, first of all, oh wow, my conception of reproductive politics has been so limited, right? I started to kind of get that sense, but also, oh my goodness, people can do this really important work, like professionally, right? And so I think it's that, and then I went down to do my graduate work in Arizona, and got connected to Native folks, especially kind of what I would call kind of doing basically health advocacy and activism work. And so started to also think a lot about the kind of very applied, kind of on the ground importance of some of these issues and some of these histories. And so I think that it's sort of those combination of the threads that kind of pull together for me. Thanks. Yeah.
I was wondering if Warren ever did any work focusing on the disproportionate disappearance and murder of Native women, or if they ever brought that into the reproductive justice fight.
Really good question. And it just occurred to me that the folks on Zoom probably can't hear the questions. So if it wasn't clear, the first question was how I became interested in this topic. So this question was about whether Warren ever kind of focused on or spoke out about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? That has received more kind of public attention of late, and even legislative attention lately. Okay, so excellent question. So the first thing I have to say is that my my colleague Liza Black, who is a historian and a member of the Cherokee Nation, is finishing, or maybe has finished. She has a book coming out in 2025 that is a history of the movement for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, that takes a continental approach. So looking at Mexico, the United States, and Canada. So one thing is just, I definitely suggest folks interested in this issue start following Liza's work. She's published other things as well. So that's one thing. But then in terms of this moment that I'm looking at, and what I've seen in particular kind of activist circles that I'm finding. So missing and murdered, not, and kind of disappearance, right? Not quite so much in terms of like a concern they're talking about. But what is, I think, notable, and what is an important kind of continuity, is that many of the folks, say, especially in the Plains, but not exclusively, who were really prominent reproductive activists, were in many cases also the same women who were very much engaged with issues of gender violence. So starting, when I talked about like a women's health clinic, a lot of these early institutions would be like a kind of women's center / battered women's shelter, right? / maybe kind of community hub for youth, right? And they would be kind of these multifaceted spaces. So many of them were very much engaged in like kind of anti-sexual violence, anti-domestic violence work. Sometimes those politics were quite fraught and complicated, but I do think it's important to note that Native reproductive justice absolutely, at least most formulation, absolutely centers freedom from gender violence as a reproductive justice issue. So that's a great question.
So I'm gonna just turn to a question on Zoom. Somebody asks, does the use of sterilization fall into the idea of the quote unquote disappearing red man from the early days of America?
Yeah, I mean, so that's it. So, right, so has long been this trope of the vanishing Indian, right? And it has a function at different times and different moments. It's often an incredibly kind of self-serving, right, kind of colonial trope that very kind of that redirects attention to the forces, right, that are bringing about, say, demographic decline, population loss, right, all of these things. Right, so they're talking about the vanishing Indian in the context of, say, ethnic cleansing and forced removals in the Southeast in the 19th, for example. And in the term, again, there's lots of talks about this vanishing Indian because both this is the time when the American Indian population nationally reached its lowest point, which speaks to the kind of devastation of the 19th century and this project of Western expansion. But also, I think vanishing Indian because of the prominence of this idea of assimilation. And right, and so I mentioned boarding schools, right, where the idea is that Native children would be assimilated. And the kind of mantra of one of the school's founders was kill the Indian and save the man. So kind of cultural genocide, right? And so another form of kind of vanishing Indian, because there won't be any quote unquote real Indian blood, right? They will be kind of stripped of their cultures. So that's just to kind of give some context for this idea that the question kind of referenced. Now, I use the word settler colonialism maybe once or twice in this talk, and that's a word that scholars sometimes use to kind of describe the processes that they see having happened historically and ongoing in colonial settings like the settler societies like the United States, where kind of the colonizing population comes to stay, right? So it's different than other kind of colonial contexts in which the primary goal is, say, the extraction of resources, right? But major, large numbers of folks never go, folks from the metropole never go to live there, never live there. And of course, the United States, Canada, also Australia, New Zealand, right? These are places where the colonizers come to stay. And part of what theorists who have really looked at this have argued is that in these contexts, what becomes really important is this kind of logic of elimination. Like one way or another, Native peoples, for this project to kind of continue, right? And for the settler society to kind of achieve dominion, permanency and dominion, right? Native peoples have to disappear in one way or another. And you can kind of see how the trope of the vanishing Indian, right, that's kind of that's work is like happening culturally, right, in terms of like how folks are thinking about this. So this is a very long answer, but it's to say that I did come to view the coercive, the kind of sterilization abuses that I found really good evidence of, which actually I talked about the 1970s, but in my book I talk about it in the earlier period as well, like in the late 1920s to the early 1940s. So I did come to see that, come to view that, kind of interpret that as a particularly kind of blatant and egregious example of this like logic of elimination, right? Of this kind of project of disappearing Native people. It's a complicated one and it's kind of a fraught one, but that is one way in which, that is kind of one interpretation that I've worked in the book. So I hope that maybe answers the question a little bit. Yeah. And then,
I apologize for maybe the broad question, but what can we do, what can we do to help these indigenous populations?
okay.
So the question, I'll just repeat it to, what can folks do to help Indigenous populations on this particular issue, I guess, right?
Yeah, well, so if it, right, like there's that, I will. So, right, so there are lots of different directions one could take. In part, it depends on kind of, I think, your particular interests, right, and investments and politics, right, and your say, when it comes to like reproductive justice, I think, following and, so money's always a good one, but I know that not necessarily, but so I think organizations that are I think part of it is like starting to follow and pay attention to the organizations doing this work, right, is a really important start. So I mentioned Sister Song, which is a women of color led national reproductive justice organization. It's headquartered in Atlanta. But I also, the two organizations that I also think are important are Indigenous Women Rising. So that is I believe the only Native American abortion fund. So it's become really important following Dobbs, but it also takes a kind of broader view, right? There's also, they also give funding for like midwifery services for Native women, right? And so financial support and mutual aid, right? So that's a really important one. And then the other one that I would mention is the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which is another organization that I think of as reproductive justice. Its primary focus is gender violence, and because it is a reproductive justice informed organization, it's very attentive to the intersections, to what she's talking about, right? Like the entanglements and the ways in which like reproductive justice is actually vital to women's safety, right? And these things are all related. And so I think that's a really good first step. I also think it's always helpful for folks, and I'm sorry I don't know more about this particular like location, but I also think it's helpful for folks to kind of see if there are any kind of Native organizations like locally that you can start to, I don't advise that everyone all of a sudden like reach out and say like, how can we help? But that you can start to kind of follow and get familiar with like what issues are of concern, what are they doing? Are there calls for support in various ways? So those are two things that come to mind. I really appreciate that question. Yeah.
Can you explain more on the paradoxical variability of Native women reproductive justice and the high amendment in relation to the Roe Constitution?
I'm going to repeat that question real quick.
I think I heard something about the paradoxical relationship between the Hyde Amendment and Roe v. Wade and
Yeah,
one other
so
thing.
it's, I think so it's that I had kind of very quickly mentioned this complicated idea that I truly wrote an entire article about, right? And y'all got a paragraph, but about the kind of that there were these seemingly kind of paradoxical realities, almost like contradictory, or at least these two realities that are in tension. And the first, and I'm really just kind of repeating the question here first, but so the one is that the first is that Roe v. Wade, the kind of promise of Roe v. Wade, right, in terms of a right to abortion, but of course it's a very kind of specific legal right to abortion, are framed in a kind of privacy context, right? So, but the promise of the right to abortion, or Roe's kind of promise of a right to abortion has never like meaningfully existed for many Native women, right? And that they have in fact faced other really significant obstacles, with I think the Hyde Amendment being a really important one. And then it's also true, I would suggest, that that doesn't mean that Dobbs doesn't matter for Native peoples, for Indian country. And in fact, when Dobbs came down, especially when the final decision, when the actual decision was actually came down, I spent a lot of time watching. This was kind of in the pandemic, and there were all these Zoom roundtables with really leading and important Indigenous feminist scholars and legal scholars, right, who were talking about the implications and doing a lot of kind of public education work. And so one of the reasons, so why is it even particularly kind of burdensome and harmful? for Native peoples, not exclusively Native peoples, but I'm gonna talk about some of those things. Well, one of the things that when one comes from the perspective of kind of abortion as healthcare, right, the kind of inequalities that already exist compound for folks. So one of in a dissenting opinion on this on the decision, right, the justices actually talked about experts predicting a rise in, I forgot the percentage, but maternal mortality, right? If Native women, or excuse me, if pregnant people, right, actually more broadly are forced to bring certain pregnancies to term, right, there will be a corresponding increase in maternal morbidity and mortality. Well, Native women already suffer disproportionate rates, about on par with Black women in maternal mortality, right? So there's that. There's the ways in which it connects with sexual violence. And again, Native women are disproportionately targets and victims of sexual violence. So that's one of the ways. But also another way is that, so Hyde Amendment still in place, right? So that's the barrier in terms of funding. Nothing's changed. And now you have the fact that Native, many states that are generally kind of red conservative states are states with high Indigenous populations, not exclusively, but like many key red states that have had a kind of anti-abortion politics that now are able to, not abide by, now that Roe is overturned, then there's also the fact that they are now in these conservative states. So Indigenous Women Rising, for example, now is often having to spend more money to provide abortion services or to help offset the expenses of abortion services for Native folks, because people are having to travel further, right, and spend more time. So those are a few of the ways. Does that kind of make sense? Start to kind of like flesh out like that like both things are true, and I think it just speaks to the need to think kind of expansively about what an actual kind of right entails, right? Because a kind of legal right has never been has never proven adequate.
So I want to suggest that we do this more informally now, and that we thank Professor Theobald for joining us today, but that we all head to go get some food, a keychain with the TUHRH logo. We grabbed that basket. Yeah. And if you wouldn't mind, when you go grab some food, sign the sheet. It's like the most important part of the day. But there's tons of food out there, so please help yourself. And we're coming out there, and I'm sure Professor Theobald will be happy to answer some more questions
Yes,
informally.
thank you.
For the question online about there was a question about assimilation boarding school processes. I think Dr. Reinhardt covers this in his class, and he does when he comes to History 200, and I hope you'll follow up with us. That was a little bit out of the, slightly out of the way.
Read a book called Education for Extinction.
Education for Extinction. Okay, thank you so much. Great. Thanks for joining us online.